So I want to try and keep it pretty simple and basic about what type of soils we have. I can get all technical, like we have two types of soils, like in Kamloops region, we have the Luva soil and Verda soil. Basically, all that means is the first one, Luva soil, is underneath the pine trees and spruce trees. All the organic matter has fallen onto the ground forest floor, and so you have this organic matter on top of what? Good old clay predominantly. So that's the first one. And vertisoil is, just like it sounds, is just good old clay. Now, depending where you live in Kamloops, and I've been fortunate enough or unfortunate enough that my brother-in-law asked me to help him with his excavating company, and we dug hundreds and hundreds of basements all over Kamloops. So I have quite an array of talent of knowing all the different types of soil that we have in Kamloops just from digging great big holes in there. So mostly in Kamloops we have clay soils. The stuff that's when it gets wet is nice and greasy, you're slipping and sliding. If you drive over top of it, it compacts even harder. When it's dry out, it goes and gets nice little cracks in it and things like that. But believe it or not, clay soils are high in good elements. And we just need to get those elements released so that the plants can pick them up. So it's actually better to have a clay soil if we work on it properly than a sandy soil, which has no moisture content, no nutrients really whatsoever. And people that live out in West Side near the dunes will know what I'm talking about. That's just silty sand. If you're from Barnhartville, you know what you got. You got good old gravel in some of those areas and then hard clay in the other areas. So we'll go through all the different ones. We're going to focus mostly on clay and how to work with that to break it up so that we can farm, plant trees, do our gardening, whatever it may be. Saying all that, like everything in life, things starting to trend differently. So I used to say, and go all the way back to my dad's time, and we would say add sand in to help break up your clay. Now they've done more research that you can actually, the sand will actually cause more problems and make it turn into concrete. So it's kind of gone from one, I think the whole world's gone from one to the other side. So we'll just stick with clay and sand. But with that, I'm more on the balance side. Everything in life is balance. Everything in nature is balance. So I still say you can use sand. It's going to have to be a really coarse, gritty sand. Don't use masonry sand whatsoever, but a coarse, gritty sand, almost on the verge of like a gravelly type sand, but in proportion to your clay. And then that still doesn't alleviate that you have to go and have good old organic matter in there. If you kind of, which most people do, if you go and Google clay soil, the answer and be all it seemed like its trends is just organic matter, organic matter, organic matter. But we're going to go through maybe some other additives for your clay soil that will help with that. So like I said, the clay soil has low organic matter. It has poor drainage, as we all know, I'm sure. In shady areas of your house, you'll get moss growing in your grass. That's just poor drainage. Okay. In the nurseries that we buy from, which are predominantly heavy clay soils, most of the B&B that we have, ball and burlap, will be that good old rich Oregon clay, which is red. They actually tile the nurseries. So they'll go down with a machine and make water. And most of the people that live in Aberdeen know this. You all have drainage around your house. You also have drainage around your pipes, all to get the water out. Tiling the fields is the same thing. It's just to add drainage to it. So clay soils have a real bad issue with drainage. And then, as a general rule, in Kamloops, we have a very high pH. Okay, so and we've seen it, you go up into Knutsford and the soil will be black, and it's like nice. That's just kind of what everybody thinks. But if you do a soil pH on that, it's going to be in the 11s, 12s. I've seen it. Predominantly, it will be in the 9. up in there, but that's way too high. For most plants, and if we're going to go and garden, your vegetable garden wants to be in a neutral area, maybe even slightly acidic. So neutral is going to be in your 6 pH range. Okay, if you want blueberries and things like that, you're going to want to be dropped below 6 and be more acidic. If you want rhododendrons, you're going to be more acidic. Okay, so we have a long ways to go from a high zone or high pH of about an 8 to get it down into a 5. Okay, depending what you're wanting to grow. Okay, so that's predominantly what Kamloops is a high pH. Lower mainland, you'll be very acidic. So if you've moved here from the lower mainland, all you think about is lime, right? It's almost bred into you, lime, 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 lime. If you put lime on your yard in Kamloops, you're actually compounding the problem, okay? So kind of got to work our way out of that. We want to use gypsum, sulfur, things like that, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's what you need to know is bring down your pH. Now, if you had a pine tree and it had the pine beetle, and it's a great big old one that you had to cut down, I can almost guarantee you that your soil will be more on the acidic side. So as the pine needles and spruce needles, if you had a cedar hedge there before, any of that kind of thing that works down into the soil, it will actually lower your pH. So what I want to say here, and hopefully most of you did bring in a sample, like a coffee cup size sample, always do a soil test, okay? Because you'll have pockets in Kamloops, predominantly, that can be all over the place, even in your own yard. If you chop down that pine tree in your yard in Westside, over here, most likely it's acidic, and over here can be quite higher pH and more alkali. Okay, so always do a soil test. If the farther you go up north, like to Barrier, the more you go east and go out to Chase and Salmon Arm and those areas, the soil actually becomes more acidic as well. And an easy indicator of that is the true natural red cedar. We don't have that in Kamloops. Where do we start seeing cedars? It will be out at the Shuswap, right? It will be up into Barrier. You start seeing cedar trees out in those areas. Those are certain trees and plants are indicators of what the type of soil is. On top of that, a good aerator, and we always get the dandelion is a good indicator of what the soil is too. And believe it or not, dandelions are very, very good for a young yard. And the reason for that is that taproot actually helps break up the clay. The more dandelions there are in your yard, they're doing their natural work, trying to break up the soil. Good aerated soil, you'll see fewer and fewer dandelions. Okay, so poor soil, hard soil, lots of dandelions. Good soil that has lots of aeration, not so many dandelions. So that's a good indicator too. And you know what? Just because of the city bylaws and that, it's always a good idea maybe to keep a few dandelions around just for that purpose. Maybe taking the seed heads off before, but who knows. So the biggest thing when it comes to the clay soils is how do we get access to that all those different elements and nutrients in the soil, and how do we break it up? So like I mentioned, if you're on a budget, you can use sand in moderation, but you want to mix it in with compost. Okay, so our biggest problem is the soil, like I mentioned, is so tight that none of the plants that you grow or try to grow, a vegetable garden, a shade tree, shrubs, all those plants, the roots can't access and penetrate into that hard clay. Okay, and then I'll go all the way back to when I was a young boy, and it's changed a little bit now, but my dad said, don't buy a $5 tree and put it in a 5-cent hole. Okay, buy a 5-cent tree and put it in a $5 hole. Okay, and almost all our problems with our trees, shrubs, vegetable gardens will come from the fact that doing the soil, one, isn't as much fun. I heard somebody, oh, look at those beautiful plants, I'm so excited. Nobody goes, oh, look at the dirt, I'm really excited about digging into this and taking my pick and trying to work that. Nobody does that, right? But all that hard work, if you break up that soil, will make those beautiful trees, your fruit trees, your vegetable garden produce better. Okay, but it's not the fun stuff. So with that hard clay, what we want to do is aerate it and get it mixed up more and more. So it's not just a case of digging a bigger hole as well. And so I'll draw a drawing in that. But we say that we should have especially if it's in clay, and if you're taking up into Aberdeen, for example, it says a basic size should be double the size of the pot. Okay. If you think about it, that will do you for a year or two until the roots get to the outside of that hole, and then the tree or shrub, whatever it may be, will just stop in stunting growth as well. And that's if it doesn't root rot first. And so if you go up into the higher parts of Aberdeen at the top of Pacific Way where the school is and the fire hall, all that area in there is just horrible. We dug a basement there, and it filled up. It was like we were digging a pool, a natural pool. Like we dug a basement and we had to bring in pumps because of all the water that kept seeping in to the house. Hopefully none of you bought the house. They actually ended up putting 4 sump pumps in the basement because it just kept going, right? I would have never built there. But anyways, that was a homeowner's thing. But that's what you're fighting against, is that just holds the water in there. And we get problems where we get root rot. So in that situation, and I want to jump here a little bit, but when you're planting, no matter how much work you're doing, if this is up in Aberdeen and this is all my clay soil, what you really want to do is actually make a bit of a pitcher's mound. And so if you're from back east like Ontario and that, you'll notice almost all their boulevard trees are mounded. Okay, and the reason for that is it's just granite underneath a couple feet of clay or soil. So, but in Kamloops, this actually acts as our granite. So you're going to make a pitcher's mound basically when you plant. That does a couple things. One is when it's first planted, the roots aren't sitting in this soil area, which is probably going to be full of moisture. Okay, and so there, if you're doing a perennial garden and you're doing, or even an annual garden, you take cannas, you take daylilies, you go and take even some of the, well, good ones will be iris, daylilies, any of those bulbs or cormers, they'll just sit in that hole and rot, okay? So then you won't have success with your plant. So in a case of that, you want to actually mound like a pitcher's mound so that tree is actually higher. Now the principles of planting the tree are the same, that you don't bury the graft and all that stuff. You just want to have it higher out. And what actually happens is that this allows moisture, excess moisture, to run on top of the hard ground while this is still nice and neat. Okay, and in this area is a mixture of basically your existing soil, which is clay, and some sand, and some higher level of organic matter or compost. Okay, so I would have like 25% your clay, 25% sand, and then 50% compost would be an ideal situation all in here, this area. Okay, and that mixture mixed up nicely will feed the tree for a long time, keeps the roots out, and eventually all those nutrients start to work down into the soil, and as the tree gets older, the roots will push down and help break up that. On top of that, this kind of mixture will also allow things like earthworms to come in. And what do earthworms do naturally? They are tunneling into this hard clay and breaking it up, okay, and making tunnels so it's aerating that hard clay. So this mixture here is what's going to feed the earthworms, right? And all the beneficial microorganisms, all the beneficial bacteria, okay, will be grown in here that will start to feed and change and alter and amend organically the soil that you have underneath. And that will start to release what's coming up and in. And that's why you have to have good compost. And I used to be against Cinnamon Ridge compost. I am a little bit, but it's changed quite a bit because of city bylaws. But even go 10 years ago, before the mandates of no Kill-X and things on your lawn, what was happening was that people take everything to the compost, and if the compost isn't hot enough, you're going to get weed seeds. If your neighbor went and put Kill-X on their lawn, mowed their lawn, took it to the Cinnamon Ridge, now what's happened is that 2,4-D is in the soil. Whereas glyphosate, which is Roundup, its half-life is neutralized almost instantly when it touches the soil. 2,4-D is a different aspect where it actually stays in the soil. I even had experience with Tordon, which is like worse than Roundup. And Tordon you can actually smell in the soil year after year. And I tried to plant a vegetable garden in that, right? So, and it does funny things. We had a ginkgo tree up at the old store, and I know I'm off topic here, but we had a ginkgo tree up at the old store on Sahali there, and it actually, we must have had some 2,4-D in the soil that was planted, and it distorted the growth, and the ginkgo became a very variegated ginkgo, and it just was not, it was always anemic, never really did anything well, just because of that. However, with the city bylaws, now most people aren't they're not using Roundup and 2,4-D or Kill-X in their lawns and stuff. So what's being produced at Cinnamon Ridge is better. You just don't really know what you're getting in it. So I just warned that, because lots of people will come up after this seminar and say, well, what do you think about Cinnamon Ridge? So I'm just preempting all that. That's what I think of Cinnamon Ridge. It's good. It's gotten better. Maybe not the best of best, but whatever. So that's what you want to do, is add organic matter to that. So that's what you do with a tree. When I'm going to talk about soil, and let's take a vegetable garden, because the same thing is with a vegetable garden. If you have that hard clay, or even glacier till, if you live in Tobiano, you have glacial till that is hard as super hard. What you want to do is actually make rows, okay, of organic matter, and so in that type of practices of gardening on clay, you probably want the bed about 3 feet apart, or 3 feet wide, and about 12 inches minimum depth, okay? And then you have your walkways in between those rows, okay? Now, what are you doing? The only bad thing is not to walk in the garden when it's wet, because when you're walking on those rows, when it's wet, you're compacting that clay even harder, okay? But using that type of gardening for your hard clay, building it up like a pitcher's mound in essence, but in nice rows, will allow the organic matter to break down and get into deeper of the soil. Plus, you're not walking on those rows, right? So your aeration is a lot higher, okay? So on those type of things for vegetable gardens, a cover crop like green manure is like a legume or fall rye, okay? And those help break up, those are really, really, really important for clay soils, especially to break up that clay, okay? So do it in September before you've harvested everything. It's a good idea to put down your green cover crop. It helps keep the soil that you're making, your organic soil, still holds it there in the winter winds when we don't have any snow cover and things like that. It helps keep the moisture in the soil, because now we're having more drought issues. So it helps keep that moisture in the soil longer, okay? It's no different than when you walk into the forest and you dig down into the forest ground. There's a lot of moisture underneath that organic mat before the clay. So that's what you're trying to do, is recreate the forest type of thing in your vegetable garden by having all this organic matter that will hold moisture, keep your nutrients, and works down into the clay soil, okay? The cover crops with that, the legume mix will have more nitrogen node fixings on it. So they're actually little round dots on the roots. Most elements, the most used element out of the bag of fertilizer, and if you look at the bag of fertilizer, you'll see nitrogen, 3 numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or potash. Nitrogen is the most is the number that's most used by a garden or your trees and shrubs. 50% of it, 50% of those three elements, 50% is needed of nitrogen for that, okay? So it's really, really important to have nitrogen. So that's why when you're using a vegetable garden, in this case, you want to make sure that that legume mix is in there to help feed organically in that. Your compost type of thing is the fall rye, which will go and create a lot of green manure. That's the green manure, okay? That helps break up the clay as well and enriches the soil organically. So if you're really into a vegetable garden, that's definitely a green manure is the way to go. If you're even trying to get your yard growing and such, and you don't want to rototill, because there again, you have two different theories on this as well. You'll have that to break up the soil, you have to get in there with a pick or a rototiller or anything like that to aerate it to get working. Then the other side will be, well, that's destroying the soil already. So you should actually go and put a green crop on this whole area that you wanted to plant. So if you wanted a perennial garden, in theory, you would go and put a fall rye mix in there or a green manure crop for 1 year to help break up that soil, on top of amending it with something like gypsum, which I'll talk about in a second. So they're always different theories, but if I'm saying for your vegetable garden, do it as a row. If you're planting like a tree or something in a hard ground, you got to do a pitcher's mound. If you're going to lay that turf or your garden, or pardon me, turf or grass seed, I still do it old school and still err on the side of that, because how many of us are actually going to do a green manure crop for a year without our neighbors complaining the whole time about this? So what you should do is break that up and rototill it. If you're going to rototill clay soil, you want to make sure that you go and moisten the area. Moisten it, not saturate it, okay, but lightly moisten it, and then rototill it in about 4 or 5 inches, okay? And nothing should be ever layered when you're doing something. So you always want to mix it up lightly with a fork or such. So if you're going to put a lawn, for example, on your good old clay, because you'll see a lot of it happens already. The reason we have water restrictions and the reason you see more like in the Saheli area where the water's just running off the lawn is dry and brown and all that's wet is the pavement. What's happened in a lot of, there again, it's not fun to do all this prep work, right? So ideally on a clay soil for a lawn, what you would do is most people will just lay it right over top of the turf, which causes problems. Somewhere along the line, you're going to pay the price. So what you'd want to do for that lawn in a new house is actually put like 1 inch of sand, 1.5 inches, 2 inches of peat. Don't leave it like that. And then rototill it in 4 or 5 inches. And that creates a nice root zone for the lawn to go and have a nice deep root zone, so that on the hottest day in the middle of summer, it still only needs to be watered once a week and your grass will still be nice and green, okay? If you layer it, and let's say you just put 1 inch of peat on top of that, or 1 inch of organic compost, whatever that may be, what will happen is that lawn will just live in that inch. And that's where we get into problems, because when you water it, the lawn will grow into that inch, the water will hit the clay and run out underneath and right out onto the roadway. And on the hottest day in June, July, August, your lawn will be nice and brown because there's not enough moisture there to sustain the plant. On the flip side of that, if you didn't do that and you've already laid out your turf, then you have to do the reverse, and you actually have to go and build the soil up from the root zone up from your lawn, okay? So you're going to leave your thatch, because that thatch actually shades and is the organic matter that you need to grow the roots. So now instead of roots going down, you need the roots, in lack of a better word, growing up. So you're going to leave the thatch to create a deeper root zone, organic area. You're going to go and top dress it with some peat and sand so that the root zone increases this way. And the grass actually is growing up and the root zone is on top of whatever it was there before. If you have an old, horrible lawn, the best thing to actually do with that lawn is to flip it upside down and then you can turf right on top of that, because that's, there again, that's your organic matter now, right? So it's nice and thick, and you can build on that. So that's what you do with lawn and clay for that. Going all the way back now, if you have a ideal lawn, what do you want to do? And because we talked about high pH, we talked about hard clay. So there are products like gypsum, okay? And gypsum's a very good one because it helps neutralize your salt in the soil, which higher up, if when you go to the mines, towards the mines, you see in Cherry Creek, you'll see all the little ponds there with really, really white on the sides. Okay, that's a sign of high salt in the soil and high pH. So what happens is the sulfur and gypsum will actually lower the amount of salt in there. Okay, neutralizes it a little bit better. That's why if you have dogs in your yard, the soil that's, or the fancy dog spot and all that, they actually have gypsum in it because the gypsum neutralizes the urea. Okay. The claim to fame to this is it basically, you put it on top of your clay soil, okay, and it works into the soil and organically, naturally changes that hard clay and aerates it, binds the really fine particles, which is clay, the real fine particles, into little balls. And as soon as you make the little balls, there's more air and surface area for water to move around in, and more air can get down into the root system. So that's a good way to start with gypsum. Any of these products is not a quick fix. So in a society where everything has to be now, this is definitely not one of those things. This is a three-year project for sure, application year after year. The nice thing about this, it doesn't take a lot to do the job, okay? So you're going to be putting 3 to 5 pounds on per 100 square feet type of thing. Okay, let's hope that's what this one says. So it's roughly that, okay? It only lasts 4 to 5 months though, okay? So, and then it loses its effect. But this is probably the one product that nobody really talks about that would be one of the most beneficial things if you have clay soil. Sulfur is the one that will help lower your pH, okay? So the sulfur sprinkled out lowers your pH, and there again, it will take about 2 to 3 years to really start noticing some things happening. But this is the one that you want to go and put in your vegetable garden for sure, if you're, or near your, if you have blueberries, things like that. Any of this is where you want to be at. Okay, so sulfur is one of the key elements for that. It's sold as Tiger 90. But it is sulfur. So that's one of the important ones. And then with the lime, so there again, when we talked about lime, still has its place here. So if you need this to make it, so if you have a compost, for example, most of the time in your compost, it will be more acidic. Okay, so you'll see that when you have a compost, especially with forest fines, you're going to lime it, not put sulfur on it. You're going to lime it to bring up your pH. Okay. If you have moss in your yard or a low-lying area that's compacted, besides aerating that area, if you go and put lime on it, because usually in those low-lying areas, moss is an indicator, there again, of more of an acidic soil. Because where do you find moss a lot of times? Underneath trees. Right? Underneath. So the soil there, as year after year, all the needles have fallen, has changed the soil into more acidic, and then the moss starts to grow. Okay, so lime still has its purpose in Kamloops, not very often. So those are the 3 elements that you definitely need. I kind of jumped away from as soil additives. So these, like sulfur is OMRI listed. So if you're trying to be organic, that is, this is still organic. Okay, so it's OMRI listed, so you're allowed to use it. When it comes to fertilizers, like I mentioned, the first one is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. So nitrogen is all, I could go into great detail, but basically it's for your photosynthesis. It is all the green. So if you need something green and growing fast, the nitrogen is what's giving you that. Okay. This is 2100. This is old school mentality, especially if it's in a lawn. 2100, if you put this on your lawn, you'll be mowing every day, right? And it just grows, 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 and it's short-lived. And a lot of that is old school thought. If you look at new bags of fertilizer, that nitrogen number actually might be higher, like 20. I think ours is like 24,612. So that 24 though, you're like, oh my gosh, that's really high. But if you look at it, they're slow releasing fertilizers now. Okay, so they're covered in basically, lack of a better word, they all have a little microchip in them that release on temperature and moisture content. So this will burn your lawn. The other ones that you pay a little bit more for won't allow the nitrogen to release at a certain temperature, so you won't burn the plant, the lawn, whatever it may be. Okay. If you are going to be inclined to use something like this, this is something we would use in your compost. If your compost is smelly and just kind of needs a kick, moisture, aeration, and some 2100 to get it real active will do it. Okay. The middle number of the bag is for your root growth. Okay, it promotes stronger flowers, promotes stronger roots, and by doing that, if you notice on all these types, your high blooming ones will be a high middle number. Okay, so the plants need that. It also toughens up the plant, but not as much as the last one. So potash is what makes the potash number, the last number on those three numbers. The potash is basically the toughness, to make the cells tougher of your plants, to make them stronger, thicker, so that they can put up with drought, cold in the winter, things like that. Okay, so you need a good broad spectrum fertilizer all the way through. There's aluminum sulfate, and aluminum sulfate is there again, helps change the pH in the soil. And if you have that blue hydrangea that you turn in more whitish now and not really blue, you'll use aluminum sulfate. If you have a blue spruce, you'll use aluminum sulfate to keep it nice and blue to help. And all you're doing is basically putting aluminum sulfate in there to make the soil more acidic and to allow that hard clay to release its elements to keep the spruce nice and blue. And if you notice, you don't have to do that when the spruce tree is like 10, 15 years old, because what's happened? It's naturally shedding its needles year after year, dropping onto the clay, working its way into the soil, and naturally changing the soil so it stays nice and blue. So going back to a vegetable garden too with the clay soils, so this is a well-rounded, well-balanced one, 8-20-20. So if you're going and using fertilizer, the chemical sides of fertilizer, so the first ones I talked about were kind of like the organic ways to actually change and alter your soil. Now we're on to the chemical way of doing it, which is what we're talking about now. But in 8-20-20, there again is lowering the nitrogen when it comes to a vegetable garden, because what happens if I put a high nitrogen on my carrots? I'm going to have carrots that have tall green growth and no carrot. Okay, so the middle number, because it's a root crop, and what did I say earlier? The middle number is for the roots and flowers. Well, that will help promote the root growth and you'll get a nice, better carrot. Okay, but saying all that, you would have had to added compost or gypsum or something in there for the carrot to go grow down and in. Taking carrots, for example, carrots is probably one of the best crops to grow if you have a really sandy soil, because they'll just keep growing down and in. So if you live out in West Side, you should be growing tons of carrots. And then we get into the soil and the compost as well. So I have some manures here and sea soil and such. We talked about green manures and why they are important. Now we're going to get kind of to the compost. So we'll have to have this conversation about talking about bio. So bio is human waste, and you'll see a lot more companies having bio in it because they just don't know can't get rid of it now. And almost all bags now, every bag of soil will have a certain level of compost, whether it be table scraps or forest fines or cinnamon ridge stuff, because there's so much of it and we're running out of peat type of thing, so they're adding more compost. So in this one, this like steer manure, for example, they actually have to say on the bag. So steer manure, this one is predominantly steer manure. It might have some straw or sawdust in it, but not compost. If you look at a Premier bag of steer manure, it will say steer and compost or mushroom compost, right? So they have to put on the compost side of things, okay? So just so you're aware of that. That's not a bad thing. I'm just telling you that that's why some bags are different, because compost is actually inexpensive for them to put in the bag and mix up with something else, okay? We talked about bio being in there. Bio with the human waste is more tested than what goes into a bag of steer manure. Or if that rancher, you go and buy it at a farm and he has a pile of steer manure or manure, that is not tested like the bio. So I want to say first off that the bio is way more tested than the farm lot feeds, okay? So it's tested for heavy metals, tested for when you go to the hospital and you get shot up full of drugs if you're sick, those drugs stay in the system, right? It's no different way they can see COVID in the waste and that. That's how they monitor it. So it goes all into that. So they test for all that. So any hormones, anything like that is tested for that. Whereas at the feedlots, it's not tested, right? So the cattle might get a shot of something, right? If it has a disease, but it's not tested like it is tested with the bio, okay? Saying that though, you want to, so we have bulk bins. There's 2 companies in there that have bio, okay? We buy our bio from Merit, and they have a hard time keeping their hospital open anyways. So the amount of pharmaceuticals and things like that is substantially lower than if you went to Vancouver and got bio from Vancouver, right? There's a difference there. And I'm not saying either is good or bad. I'm just telling you there's a difference, okay? And that one is tested more than the other. Do I have bio in my vegetable garden? No, I just can't get past that, okay? It's funny because you'll do the cow stuff, but you won't do, anyways. So, but I don't do bio in my vegetable garden, but if I'm doing shade trees and stuff, I have no harm doing that. And actually the bio makes your plants grow way better than the same kind of product as a steer manure, okay? It's just interesting. So, but we still keep it separate. And like I mentioned, I would put steer manure down or mushroom compost or whatever it may be on my vegetable garden. Now saying that, if you're going to put manure down, I would put your manure down in the fall, okay? Because there's still some E. coli concerns and things like that. And the reason we're talking about this is what we're talking about when it comes to composting. Add organic matter to your garden to help break up that clay. So this is why we're talking about this. We want to make sure that that's done in the fall, or that it's really, really aged manure, okay? You can come in here some days and the mushroom farms, which isn't manure at all. Like, it's really weird. It's not much, but you can tell it's a hot compost, okay? You can smell it. It's steaming, and all it is we'll have peat moss in it. It'll have the tailings of the mushrooms from Money's Mushrooms Farm, right? And straw all in it, okay? And that's why if you've ever driven down through Chilliwack, they've made because the soil, the companies that actually make the soil, they reek, right? And they actually make them keep going farther and farther and farther out the valley, right? Because nobody wants to deal with it. But in coming in here, it's actually one of the better products. But you want to put that down on in the fall, okay? Because when I talk about hot, I'm talking about lots of nitrogen, okay? And that nitrogen, if you put it down into your vegetable garden, rototill it in, mix it all up and do all that stuff, it's still hot enough that it may burn your germinating seeds coming out. So anything hot like that, you want to put down in the fall so it has a chance to cool down. The E. coli, if there's a concern about that, it has passed, and you can rototill it in the early spring and have your garden ready to go for this time of year. So anything chemical, fertilizers, will be like kind of like steroids. Bang now, instant gratification, and will work right away. A liquid fertilizer will work faster than a granular, okay? Anything organic, so your mushroom manure, your steer manure, your chicken manure, all of those, anything organic, if you go over into the Gaia Green line, which is glacial till, green sand, all those type of products, right, which are all natural, all occurring, their three numbers are substantially lower. We're talking 211. We're talking maybe on chicken you'll get 3 or 4 on the nitrogen, right? But it's still lower. And now we have a hard time even getting chicken because of all the things going on with that. So we can't get it this year, but we had it last year. So, but they are substantially, anything organic is substantially lower in those three numbers, but it's actually building and changing the soil composition, which is, in your end game is way farther ahead for the soil. You're building the soil, you're building humus and all that. So it's better to do it that way. So, and then I'll just say, and I think most people know about sea soil, and this is, to me, one of the best products. In my vegetable, it is what is probably double the manure. And the reason why I like this product, and I'll tell you how I kind of, nobody's going to go out and do their whole garden in this on top of your clay. But you work year after year with it. And the reason I like it, it has forest fines in it, which is composted bark. I like it because the composted bark is thick, okay? So you don't have to add sand into your clay. That composted bark will go and break up the clay. And I should mention for 1 second, the darker the compost, the better the compost. And the reason for that is, if you took shavings, right, from the mill, horse shavings, stall shavings, whatever it may be, and they're nice and coarse, yes, but they're quite white. And what has to happen is that white has to be broken down and decomposed, and so it steals nitrogen from the soil to break down. That's why you use 2100 in compost, or at least we do, in compost to break down that bark so that it turns black. So my preference would be like Nature's Gold, if you can handle the little bit of bio in it, or a composted forest fine like this has, okay? And how they do this is that they put fish in it as well. So it's organic. So, and it comes from all the way at the top end of Vancouver Island. So what they use the fish as the nitrogen source to break down the compost, the forest fines, okay? And then they add in some kelp in there. So the kelp is what really is the kicker for me is there, because kelp is known as a beneficial, gives off beneficial bacteria and organisms to help fight a lot of different diseases, especially with like tomatoes. Okay, so what I did with my vegetable garden is I actually took a couple of handfuls and mixed it in the little hole with my tomato. And then I figured year after year, if I put a couple little handfuls all along my tomatoes, by the time, 10 years from now, my whole row will be predominantly sea soil, right? So that's how I justify it. So, but I wouldn't go out and just, even though I could probably steal a pallet from here, I could do all in one day, but it just doesn't make any sense. So that's what I do with that. And that's all you need to really do to begin with. With my clay soil that we had in Rayleigh, it just That's all I would do. Mix it up and lighten it up. Okay. So, but this is, if the example I wanted to give you is that if you don't want to do the forest fines or they're not dark enough, then you can even go to a bark mulch. So when you're planting that tree or your shrubs or whatever it may be, we go and take, so actually all the trees that are potted here, we take fine bark mulch, which is brown, add in nitrogen, add in some lime, because why? It's more acidic. Wait a month, 2 months, rotate it, aerate it, wash it, and then guess what happens? It decomposes. Then we add a little special mix and some fertilizer to it, and some peat and a little bit of sand for drainage, and then that's what we have growing in all our trees. Okay, and so you'll find that every grower, whether you're a pot grower, a home grower, garden grower, or a nursery grower, once you figure out your mix, you don't really change it, right? Like most of the pot growers, if they grew a number 4, still do, if they won't change the Premier or Berger. So it's really unique. So once you find your blend for your yard, and that's the thing I want to end off on, is once you find the blend for your yard, stick with it if it works for you, because every yard, and even if you have clay, sand, or whatever, will really change your soil, but it is particular to your area. So I think that's about it. I didn't want to drag on too much and get too technical.